now turn it over to Jeremiah Morlock for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Jay. Before I start, so I've got COVID, so my voice is kind of terrible. I'm fully vaccinated, so other than my voice being completely shot, I'm doing okay. Everything's all right, but just know I unfortunately have this scratchy voice for the presentation. So to let you know, okay. So I have some thoughts about fascism and its relationship to freedom, and particularly in relationship to some ideas from the early Frankfurt School. Fascism and freedom are easy and satisfying to frame in binary terms, but the reality is that they are both slippery with plenty of confounding connections to one another. The difficulties were illuminated very well by the early Frankfurt School, and their honest grappling with them led them to come out with lots of statements that people considered to be pessimistic. It's true that they pose no simple solutions to the problem of modern capitalism, but then world events have not manifested in simple political solutions either. There have been many partial victories and many problems as well. And as they lamented back in the mid-20th century, and it's still true obviously today, the world is not now a socialist utopia. The potentiality is always there, but the problem is that we face is one of actually making it true. So this has always been the problem. So to learn from the impasses and catastrophes of the 20th century, I see it as a necessary prerequisite to consciously and strategically move the world towards a functional, stable, harmonious post-capitalist society. The early Frankfurt School essentially smack us over the head with these impasses and catastrophes. They also offer brilliant insights into the potentiality of humanity. So in Dialectic of Enlightenment, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno lay out a multidimensional dialectical pathways that connect myth and enlightenment. In this story, the modern world, born out of the Enlightenment, seeking a society where reason can reign, liberated from medieval traditions and beliefs, always contains the seeds of fascism. And in the modern world, liberal democracy directly gives way to fascism. Bourgeois thought is bought at the price of itself, or bourgeois freedom, I'm sorry, is fought at the price of itself. The freedom of modernity is simultaneously its unfreedom. So among many retellings, they describe Odysseus's encounter with the sirens in Homer's Odyssey. Even in ancient Greek mythology, they find themes that were to become dominant in the modern Enlightenment. Odysseus foreshadows the modern bourgeois individual who overcomes the gods and the forces of nature through cunning. And in this particular scene in the Odyssey, Odysseus commands the crew of his ship to sail through the territory of the sirens, whose seductive and ecstatic songs are so alluring they drive men to unknowingly kill themselves. Odysseus finds a way to experience the song, but to overcome their deadly power by having his crew tie him to the mast of his ship. So in this way, he secures his freedom from the sirens' omnipotence, but it's also, and he's outdoing the gods and being supremely powerful himself, but his method is by becoming literally bound and helpless. This is broadly the exchange that humanity has undergone through the Enlightenment and the transition to the modern world. We fought our freedom from traditional institutions and beliefs by subjugating ourselves to capital and the administered world its birth. Looking to dominate the natural world around us through science, reason, and technology, we've also dominated our inner selves through science, reason, and technology. And now, both in our conformity with modernity's domination by instrumental rationality and in our rebellion against it, we move toward fascism. Erich Fromm's book on fascism, called Escape from Freedom, was published within comparably the same time as Horkheimer and Adorno's book. Fromm's theory is different, but again, there's this issue of the intertwining of problems of freedom and power and the ambivalent sort of relation to power that fascist minds typically exhibit. Adorno and Fromm agree that sadomasochism is a powerful psychological motivation of fascist movements. Fromm outlines a theory of the relationship of capitalism to sadomasochism and fascism that pivots on the issue of freedom. Essentially, Fromm says that the sadomasochistic character is endemic to modern capitalism because it's an attempt at attaining something emotional and psychological that people need and that capitalism structurally inhibits, which is human connection. The typical modern person is more formally free than the typical person living in the European Middle Ages, But the person of today is more alienated and less protected. What would truly satisfy our need for connection would be a kind of deep relatedness that preserves our individuality at the same time and allows a kind of thorough mutual recognition. But alone and competitive under capitalism, it's impossible for many people to attain this equal relationship. And so the longing for connection is sought in relations of power and inequality, such as in sadomasochism, destructiveness, or conformity. So these surrogate forms of connection fit fascism, and so does the person who chronically seeks them out. These ideas, if you accept them, can help to explain where fascism comes from, how it gets its appeal, why liberal democracies turn in fascist directions, and so on, but they do not say much about fascism itself. Fascism has a precise meaning and a wide meaning. Hardly anyone uses its precise meaning anymore, but its wide meaning is definitely authoritarian. Fromm sometimes talks about the authoritarian character, which was sadomasochistic. Adorno and his colleagues have a famous study on the authoritarian personality as well. So, so the wide fascist definition is also generally populist and probably racist. The term fascism has historical importance and power as a kind of alarm signal. So people often wield it generally, though, as synonymous with authoritarianism simply. And for this reason, it can be kind of unhelpful. Still, between the socially obsolete precise definition and the popular vague definition, there is a collection of factors and forces that are maybe more present in the world now than they've ever been. And so this is grounds for being very concerned and definitely for talking about this collection of as an object, as an it. So I think the term authoritarian populism is pretty good, combining an amount of precision and vagueness. I've done some writing on trying to define this term in our own way with my co-author Felipe Ziadi Narita. So I'm going to summarize and read a little bit from something we have recently published on it. I'll put the name of it in the chat. So saying authoritarian populism can be very broadly defined as a movement where people seek to decrease social difference through the increased use of force. And social difference also, think social deviance. So it can also be understood as a conjuncture of two different but related objects, authoritarianism and populism. So we explain the conjuncture with reference to a typology of populist narratives, each one which is based on a binary opposition between the people, the defined people, and some other group. So the first one is the people against the elite, and we refer to this as the liberation narrative. So this is where elites can only narratively exist if the people are articulated as non-elites. And so in this narrative, the importance of the people is in their non-elite status. Here, the story is that elites have too much power and perhaps have recently increased their power, decreasing the people's power and recognition. The coherence and solidarity of the people grows with experience of alienation from elites, especially in light of the polarization grounded in social resentment due to a sense of growing inequalities, political exclusion, and injustice. The people want to overturn this alienated, disempowered, and disrespected state, and to shrink, if not erase, the distance that separates them from the elite center. This can be seen across all varieties of populism, left and right, democratic, and authoritarianism. Okay, so skipping ahead, the next one is people against the outsiders. And so we refer to this as the nationalism narrative. Outsiders can only exist to the extent that the people are articulated as insiders. So in this narrative, the importance of the people is in their insider status. But the story is that outsiders have grown in power and recognition by growing in numbers relative to the people, impoverishing the power and recognition of the people as their relative numbers shrink. The coherence and solidarity of the people grows with its experience of disalienation, meaning sharing of space, from outsiders. Their experience of difference from outsiders makes their disalienation from outsiders more threatening the closer or more prominent they become. The people want to be further from the outsiders. They have to reject the outsiders, and ultimately they want to stay entirely distinct from the outsiders. This has a more implicitly authoritarian flavor. It's prone to involve scapegoating and implies that the road to empowerment of the people is through the probably forceful exclusion of outsiders. And then the third type is the people against the non-people. We don't have a name for this one. There's a lot of different varieties of it. So say this is a combination of the other two narratives and is specifically authoritarian. It comes in two basic variations. One is an infiltration narrative where the story is outsiders are or have become elites. And the other is betrayal, where elites are aligned with outsiders more than with the people. So also possible for there to be a mixed version, especially when there's multiple types of outsider groups. So the people, non-people narrative is also a rich ground for paranoia and conspiracy theory. And far-right leaders will echo these various narratives in their rhetoric and public displays. So we were returning again, we refer to the people versus elite populist narrative as concerning liberation. And again, we don't mean to imply that all liberation movements are authoritarian. Truly liberating non-authoritarian populism is possible, always in principle and sometimes in actuality, but liberation is a moment of release from a specific oppressor, whereas freedom, if it's really worth all this hand-wringing about it, should be sustainable, not a negation of the existing fetters, but an affirmation organically embedded in the structure and culture of a new society. So then what does it mean for a society to be free? So there are maybe infinite things to legitimately point to, ideologies, government, social attitudes, whatever, and say, that's not really freedom. It's important to do that. But I'm just going to mention two suggestions that kind of do the other thing to close out. The first one, if there is a way toward freedom, it has to involve self-actualization, but not a private self-actualization at the expense of engagement with society. So it has to be an arena of self-actualization that spans public and private spheres of life, where opportunities for autonomous agency are there, but so also is the sense of collective life, where what I do matters for you and vice versa. This is really in concert with the implied inverse of Marx's formulation of alienated labor. So an unalienated experience of activity where I'm connected with what I make. I'm engaged in the envisioning and laboring parts of the process of creation. My efforts are recognized in palpable ways in the social context that I participate in, and my species being or my humanness is able to be actualized and exercised through my activity. Liberation from alienated labor does not equal the abolition of effort. It means the rejoining of the circle so that I'm not becoming impoverished by the fruits of my efforts, going out to the capitalist or to the faceless system in exchange for wages. Instead, I can enjoy the fruits of my efforts on several different levels. The benefits stay with me, both because I'm afforded more autonomy and because I'm more connected with other people who benefit from my efforts. This is not a recipe for a society of lazy people who don't do anything because they aren't forced to. It's a society filled with social self-actualization where people have greater opportunities to develop their capacities in arts, crafts, sports, other sorts of avocations. It's also about unleashing human potential rather than squandering it, such as happens under capitalism madly. So the second thought, Herbert Marcuse introduced another really important way of understanding freedom in a sense that does not generate domination in his notion of liberation from the performance principle and from surplus repression. So these are rooted in, but also taking distance from Sigmund Freud's vision of the inevitable dissatisfactions of just being a human being in society. For Freud, becoming mature and socially integrated involves being willing to repress or at least translate what we want into socially acceptable conciliatory forms. So subjecting the pleasure principle to the reality principle, meaning basic impulses for sex and violence are sublimated into friendship and competition, things like that. I'd like to refer to this as a kind of self-alienation and unfreedom, as it is a distancing of oneself from one's deep feelings and an inhibition against acting according to them. Marcuse accepts the basic Freudian premise, but insists with Marx that capitalism instills its own forms of alienation. In this way, the self-alienation and unfreedom that Freud points to is made into a more severe sort of self-alienation and unfreedom. Some bare minimum of repression is intrinsic to living in society. It's impossible to know exactly what this minimum means or is, but under capitalism, this minimum of socially necessary repression is grossly exceeded due to the necessity of conforming not only to the reality principle, but to the performance principle, or in other words, to the historically specific pressures of contemporary society that add on top of the minimum that we might imagine as being biological or practical or inherent or something like that. In the case of contemporary capitalism, I'd say it points to what you need to show up for in order to sink rather than swim in a competitive society, catering to excessive demands at the workplace and doing it not because it has to be this way for the common good, although neoliberals will sometimes claim that, but it's in the interest of capital accumulation. So freedom in a socialist or post-capitalist world can still have a meaning as life which is liberated from the excessive self-alienation demanded under contemporary capitalism to ensure personal success. Thanks, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Jeremiah. And so that was our first speaker. We have three more speakers. Les Leopold will be next, and then Eric Lerner. And then our last speaker, who I gave an introduction, but I was pointed out to not mention her name because I was so excited about getting to her really important work, is Marcy Smith Parenti. So right now we're going to turn it over to Les Leopold.
What exactly can you see on the screen right now?
I see the copy, the title of your book.
That's it?
Yeah, and on the right-hand side, it says next slide. But
All right, hang on. Just one sec. We're going to fix that. How about now?
Yeah, just the one.
And you can hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. I'm going to take a look at a particular period of capitalism and concentrate on what I think is the neoliberal period beginning around late 70s, mid-late 70s. So what do I mean by neoliberalism? When we talk to working people, we don't use the word because it's confusing, right? In today's context, liberal means something very different than what this term means. This refers back to the 19th century version of free markets. Okay, so what is neoliberalism? This is the model. What I'm going to share with you is what we do in the programs that we've developed for working people in unions around the country. A version of this I just used 2 days ago with the New Jersey Education Association. 220 people were there for this one. But I'm focusing on just a few of the pieces for you all today. All right, so what is neoliberalism? The first piece, well, let me just say, this grew up and took hold in the 1970s. It became the Keynesians looked like they were failing, that we had both inflation and unemployment at the same time. We had, two big oil shocks, and the established policy community didn't know how to handle it. And in came the Milton Friedman kind of a conservative free market school. And they said, look, we can solve this for you. You just have to follow this plan. And this plan more or less got adopted by both political parties. I think Jimmy Carter was the first one to kind of get into this. And then, of course, Reagan took over, and this was going on with Margaret Thatcher big time in England. But I'm going to give you a very rarefied, simplified version. First element is cut taxes. And we all know this means cut taxes on the wealthy is usually what happens, because they will invest it. If they cut taxes on us, we're just going to spend it. So you have tax cuts. That's element number one. Element number two is deregulation. And what they were they're talking about everything, environment, OSHA, all that stuff. But what they really meant deep down was free Wall Street from 30 years of very tight regulations that grew out of the New Deal, and stop coddling unions, crush them if you can. And because unions are in the workplace, that's the biggest regulation that you have to worry about, not stuff coming in from the outside. The third element was cut government social spending. So few people as possible get anything for nothing. So they'll be hungry and they'll go out and work. And finally, privatize every public function you can think of, because the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. No matter what, post office, education, you name it, we should privatize it. All that comes together and investment goes up, profits go up, and then all boats will rise. This is what was sold to both political parties. And you can hear echoes in this all over the place. When people talk about, when we don't use the word neoliberalism, we use the better business climate model. And that's what, how do we make our area more friendly to business? We've heard that, thousands of times. Okay. So what happens as a result of this model? We can see it pretty clearly. I hope everybody can see this. If not, I'll try to explain it. The first line here is the productivity in the United States from 1947 roughly until today. And it's more or less a 45-degree line, goes up and up and up, sometimes a little flatter, down a little bit, but overall, we become very, very productive. What does productivity mean? It's the sum, the simple definition is the amount of goods and services produced per hour of labor, not how much you pay labor, but per hour of labor calculated across the whole economy. And what it measures is our total level of worker effort, management coordination, infrastructure, education, all that comes together to produce, to make it possible to produce what we produce. And we're roughly 3 times as productive per hour of labor as we were in 1947. And we probably have 2.5 times as many people working, maybe 3 times as many people working. So we produce a lot of stuff, alienated, unalienated, and everything in between. Probably most of it alienated, but we produce a lot of stuff. Now, the second line I'm going to show you is the average weekly wage of the non-supervisory and production worker. That's 85% of all the working people in this country. We're going to and this is real wages after you take out the impact of inflation. From 47 till the mid 1970s, late 1970s, every time productivity went up, real wages went up for the average worker. So there was, in fact, a rising standard of living in America across the board. There was a gap between white, black, and brown, but all 3 categories, and men and women, all the categories were going up from 1947 till the mid 70s. Matter of fact, when I was in grad school, right about when these 2 lines were still together, they told us this was more or less an iron law. It was built into capitalism. It wasn't going to change. Well, no sooner did I graduate, they took the iron law and melted it, because here's what's happened since. The average real wage has actually gone down. Now we're going to read, we're hearing a lot in the paper today that wages are booming, et cetera, but so are prices. So we'll see what the average real wage is in the next couple of years. But it's actually we peaked in 1977. Working people had the average working person had their highest standard of living in 1977. So we've had 40 years, more than 40 years of stagnation for the average working person. Now we're talking about several generations. And I think this is a key factor behind authoritarianism. So let's let the rise of authoritarianism. Let's move on here to, oh, by the way, if we stayed on the line, the average weekly wage today would be double what it is now. Double. So where did all that money go? Where did it all go? The gap between the 2 lines, by the way, is roughly $2.5 trillion a year now. That money went someplace else. It didn't go to working people. All right. So first place to look would be what happened to CEO pay, CEO versus the average worker. 1970, the gap was 45-1. Pretty big gap. Pretty big gap. It means like if you could afford 1 car, they could afford 45 cars. 1 house, 45 houses. Send 1 kid to school, send 45 kids to school. 1980 up to 127-1. 1990, 326-1. Today, I mean, in this last decade, 802-1. Almost incomprehensible. So it's pretty clear the money floated to the top. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I could show you, dozens of charts that confirm this from different angles. Now, how did the attack on unions turn out, the deregulation part of it? Well, here's private sector unionism since early 1970s. kind of peaked again, 1977. There were about 15 million people. We're down to about 7 million people in private sector unions. What about public sector unions? Well, they went up, especially in the early 70s, then sort of going flat, now coming down. The attack on public sector unions, or at least holding them at bay. There are now actually more public sector workers than there are private sector workers. So the attack on unions has been pretty successful. How about the deregulation of finance? Again, there's 50 charts to show you this, but I'm just going to pick one, which is the assets owned by the top 4 banks, just 4 banks. 1992, that was 10.5%. Today, the top 4 banks have over 50% of all the financial assets in the country. 4 banks. So I think the deregulation from Wall Street's perspective worked beautifully. And these banks can never fail. I don't care what anybody says. They can never fail. Okay, so this was not just a change in economic policy. It also changed, I think, the way most people viewed the world. And this is kind of very scary. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how I put this, since I came of age before neoliberalism, I have some actual real sense of how this has changed. Here's one that you'll love. If you want an education today, you're supposed to go into debt. I mean, it's just assumed you're going to go into debt. Now, in the 1960s, if you had a summer job, you could afford to go to virtually any state school in the country. And if you lived in New York or you lived in California, it was tuition free. That's what normal was. But today, you raise that and it's, oh my God, it's a tremendously radical social democratic reform. This was the norm of the 1960s. It's hard to describe the 1960s as, a socialist utopia in America, but this was the norm. All right, here's another one. If you're poor or jobless today, it's assumed it's your fault. Somehow you have not worked hard enough. You have not picked yourself up by your bootstraps. You have not paid enough attention in Jay's classes. It's been a problem for you. Again, in the 1960s, it was understood that poverty was rediscovered, Michael Harrington, then the Kennedys, et cetera, that poverty was a function of a structure of capitalism. There weren't enough jobs in the inner city. There weren't enough jobs in Appalachia. It was a black and a white problem. It wasn't your fault. It was something that society had to do something about. All right, here's another one. And this I've mentioned already, but today, if you're a public sector worker, it's assumed you're less valuable than a private sector worker. Now, this again is a flip of the 1960s. The Kennedys, again, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. The idea of public service, it was a high calling. I don't know if you guys remember, and gals, the movie The Graduate, right? The punchline was plastics. The idea that you would go work in the plastics industry as a high calling was a joke. Everybody laughed in 1969 when that phrase came up in the movie. I hate to admit it, but it was hard to get a summer job as a postal worker. You had to pass a test. You had to score high. And I didn't score high enough to get the job. Public service was a good thing, not a bad thing. Look how much that has changed. And finally, if you want a poverty program, go to jail. Let me show you some data that supports this. This chart shows the rise in student loans in trillions of dollars. Today, it's 1.7 trillion. There's more student debt than there is credit card debt. Think of the burden on this, it's basically peonage for students and their families, for many, for a long, long time, debt peonage. All right, here's an interesting one. We tell our kids to get a high school diploma at the very least, right? At least get a high school diploma. So here's some data on high school grads 17 to 20 years old. And it's how many are unemployed and underemployed by group. Underemployed means they have a part-time job, they want a full-time job. Black kids, these are high school graduates, 17 to 20 years old, over 40% unemployed or underemployed. Latino, 26.9%. Anglo, 25.2%. It's worse for African-American kids, but it's pretty bad across the board. Oh, by the way, here's Denmark. Same statistic, 2%. What a difference between our neoliberal version and their neoliberal version. So what happens to these kids? What happens to the people who don't have, pull themselves up properly by their bootstraps? We have an answer. Let me show you the prison population. From 1910 on, by the way, it's the same, the chart is exactly the same in shape if we look at percentage of the population. 1910, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Now we hit the it's basically very, very low. Now we hit the 1960s and 70s. You know, we were a wild bunch, sex, drugs, rock and roll, hardly goes up. Now watch what happens when neoliberalism hits, 1980, 85. Watch this. It goes from about 150,000 to today, we've got over almost 2.3 million people in jail. I would say that's a pretty strong case for unfreedom. 2.286 million people in jail. We lead the world, not just in raw number, but in percent as well. And we talk about drug overdoses. We now have there's a whole book called Deaths of Despair. That number, that shape is exactly the same shape as the neoliberal inequality. We've got over 100,000 deaths per year now. By the way, most of these are Anglo. And that's gone up from like 2,500 a year back in the wild 1960s when everybody was getting stoned. Not this. How is this now the cauldron for authoritarianism? Well, one thing wealthy people do, the more money you put to the top, the more money they put into politics. So that they get a grip on the political system. This is the corporate contributions just since 1992. We're up now, you can see a big jump after Citizens United. We're up to almost $6 billion a year invested in politics. By the way, labor invests about 120 million. So it's 200 million. We're talking 6 billion versus 200 million. All right. And this is how it comes together. In order to have authoritarianism, you have to destroy the idea of the public good. And the expression of the public good is government, is the idea that government can actually be something that can serve people. So attitudes toward government is, I think, a very important thing to keep an eye on. And it's absolutely collapsed. In the 60s, 77% in 1964 had a favorable view of government. And now it's down to 24%. How does this play out in frustration and in voting patterns? Let's take a look at the Trump vote. We did a study of the Trump vote in Pennsylvania. And I went into the study firmly believing that blue collar workers were not as populist as Jeremiah had postulated, as the media said, that they were more split, more Biden oriented. And I was shocked to come up with the results we came up. We looked at 3,000 voting districts and ran regressions on them to try to figure out what was the independent impact of different variables, holding everything else constant as you move from neighborhood to neighborhood. And it turned out that the strongest indicators for the Trump vote would be older people and blue collar workers, mostly blue collar men, holding everything else constant. Now, many of these voters, many of them voted for, blue collar voters voted for Obama. There's a group of people up for grabs. I just want to tell you what I do and then I'll stop. How do we fight rising authoritarianism? What we do is we try to get into dialogue with people who don't agree with us. We try to go for more centrist blue collar workers around the country. We try to set up training programs where we train trainers. We have like an 8-hour version of what I just went through. which I'll show you where to get. It's free. You can take it whatever you want, use it however you want to use it. But we want to talk to people in an educational setting, which we think is the least threatening to anybody, and have people from their own unions run these training programs. We have a very large one going on with Communication Workers of America. It's actually very good local in Staten Island that does this. There's about 60 of them who are trainers. They train in pairs. The union, God bless them, takes 1,000 people a year out of work for a day, pays them to go through an 8-hour version of this runaway inequality curriculum. And they believe it has a major impact on fighting fascism, authoritarian attitudes within their own union. They had over a third of their people voted for Trump, they think, probably higher. So that's what we try to do. We're privileged to have these openings. We're trying to do the same thing inside the Teamsters, inside the food commercial workers, side of other unions. But all we can do is urge everybody to try to reach out to people that don't already agree with us. Let's widen the conversation and see if we can't engage in dialogue. If you want more information, check out runaway-inequality.org. The curriculum's there. You can have it. And I'll talk to Jay later about trying to get you more books. There's a special offer right now. We're going to give you books for free over, Jay. So contact me and I'll get you some. All right. Thank you very much. And thanks again for inviting me here.
Okay. Thank you, Les. And we will be in contact with you about the book and the presentations, the PowerPoint presentation. And just to let everyone know, this presentation and the previous one will also be made available for everyone and for the public. So our next presenter is Eric Lerner, and then it will be Marcy Smith Parenti. And Eric, just make sure Marcy is has access to the share screen as well.
Right, I think she already does.
Okay, she is great.
Let me. Marcy, you should, okay. All right, you should see this now as your co-host. Okay, so can I start?
Yes, go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the relationship between the fascism and the fascist movement of today, especially in the period of the pandemic, and the fascist movements of the 20th century. So what is the key idea of fascism? The key idea of fascism is the complete centrality of the individual. The basis of society is atomized individuals, and the strong individual must dominate the weak. From this flows a rigidly hierarchical authoritarian society in which each strong individual obeys those over him and has complete domination of those under him. And this relationship between individualism and fascism, don't take my word for it. Let's hear from a leading theorist of 20th century fascism. So let's see whether we can get this. So I hope people are seeing just this, my share screen, right?
Yes, that's what we're seeing.
So quoting this individual, the movement must use all possible means to cultivate respect for the individual personality. It must never forget that all human values are based on personal values and that every idea and achievement is the fruit of the creative power of one man. Human progress and human culture are not founded by the multitude. They are exclusively the work of personal genius and personal efficiency. Man must realize that a fundamental law of necessity reigns throughout the whole realm of nature, and that his existence is subject to the law of eternal struggle and strife. He will then feel that there cannot be a separate law for mankind, where the strong are always masters of the weak, and where those subject to such laws must obey them or be destroyed. The expert continues, but such preservation goes hand in hand with the inexorable law that it is the strongest and the best who must triumph, and they have the right to endure. He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight in a world where permanent struggle is the law of life has not the right to exist. Therefore, in its organization, the state must be established on the principle of personality, starting from the smallest cell and ascending up to the supreme government of the country. So the end of that quote. So the psychological appeal of this fascist ideology is the identification of the individual with the leader, with the strongest. And it means giving up real autonomy for the satisfaction of dominating others, down to, of course, the scapegoated individuals who can be dominated by anyone and, if necessary, physically destroyed. In 20th century fascism, this fundamental anti-social celebration of the individual was tied with the idea of the sacrifice of the individual to the mystical community of the Volk. The interests of the Volk were very vague, but were determined exclusively by the leader. So to go back to our expert, since true idealism is essentially the subordination of the interests in life of the individual to the interests in life of the community, this idealism accords in its innermost essence with the final purpose of nature. This feeling alone makes men voluntarily acknowledge that strength and power are entitled to take the lead, and thus makes them a constituent particle in that order out of which the whole universe is shaped and formed. So we have the idea that the sacrifice of the people for the folk, for the sacrifice of the individual for the folk or the people, boils down to acknowledging the leadership of the strong at all levels. According to our leader, whose name many of you may have guessed is Adolf Hitler, and these are quotes from an English translation of his book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Fascism emerged in the 20th century after World War I as an ideology of despair. It was the despair that the socialist left, workers' organizations, or even indeed any of the organizations of society could actually benefit the individual. Cooperation had failed, trust had collapsed. Out of this despair arose the fascist glorification of the strong individual who subordinated himself only to the stronger. In this way, the radical opposition to capitalism of the millions of adherents of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, the Nazi Party, and the millions more who adhered to the fascist parties worldwide were mobilized in the service of capitalist dictatorships that enslaved tens of millions, killed tens of millions, and enriched thousands of capitalists. In the process of nearly destroying civilization and nearly plunging the world into a dark age, during the course of World War II. So let's look at fascism today. 21st century fascism also centralizes the idea of individual strength. It is what I call the ideology of me-firstism. Freedom to this ideology means allowing the strong to do as they like. Those who are strong will survive COVID. It's not even a threat to the strong. The strong can kill the weak in self-defense, as we see in the Arbery and Rittenhouse cases. The strong can protect their own bodies from invasion by vaccine, but have the right to dominate the bodies of the weak, force women to have sex with them, force them to have children that they don't want, and so on. Masking and vaccination during the pandemic, quarantines, are particular threats to the sense of individual strength, since vaccines are obviously the product of the effort of the entire society, and masking and quarantine imply an obligation to others, and also that the virus is in fact a risk to all. So anti-masking and anti-vaccine movements, which have been strongly promoted by the right wing, feed into the basic fascist ideology that the strong must be free to do as they like, to look after themselves, and that their freedom is the freedom to oppress the weak. If you get COVID because I cough, it's obviously because you are weak and I am strong. Thus also we have the deathbed conversions of the anti-vaxxers who actually get COVID and realize too late that they are not among the strong. But the anti-vaccine and anti-masking, the COVID is conspiracy, feeds not only among right-wingers, openly, people who are openly advocates of right-wing quasi-fascist ideology, the ideology of I am strong so I can do everything I like to you. The anti-vaccine, anti-masking also appeals to the left-wing individualism and the New Age self-help movement, the we can do it yourselves utopianism that Jay and I personally encountered in the leadership of Occupy Wall Street. Again, these movements, whether right or left in rhetoric, reflect a collapse of trust in all social action. Even protest is mainly a route to withdrawal from society, not for social transformation. All of these movements are profoundly anti-statist, but beyond that, they are deeply anti-social. Society has betrayed them, so they can only count on themselves, not try to change society, which requires trusting others in a movement. I suspect Marcy will talk more about this, so I won't go into it any further. Despite the deep ideological commonalities of 21st century fascism and 20th century models, the movement today has severe weaknesses. The collapse of the prestige of the military through the long wars reinforced rather than undermining the so-called Vietnam syndrome. This has left the new fascist movement of the 20th century without a concept of a strong hierarchy or of sacrifice for a mystical folk. We can see examples of this. For example, look at January 6th. There could have been a real coup if a half dozen determined and disciplined individuals with fully automatic weapons had shot enough Democrats to leave a Republican majority. Trump could have been reelected at gunpoint. But the idea of such headlines appearing in any journal other than The Onion is clearly ridiculous, not only because of Trump's own scatterbrained personality, but the lack of discipline of these quasi-militias like the Proud Boys. Second example, Can anybody imagine Adolf Hitler laughing awkwardly, as Donald Trump did, when his own followers loudly booed him for suggesting that they get vaccinated? Clearly today, the cult of the individual, me-firstism, dominates even over the cult of the savior. The current movements lead to the vigilantism of the Mad Max movies, not to the sort of disciplined fascist regimes that occurred in the 20th century. We see this, for example, in the Texas abortion laws, which actually legalized vigilantism. These weaknesses have prevented, so far, a fascist movement from taking over any major country. But of course, ideological viruses can mutate as biological ones can. So this is not a guarantee. Unfortunately, capitalism does not need fascist movements in power for capitalism to stay in power. What it needs is a fascist movement to keep the working class divided. Tucker Carlson and other employees of Rupert Murdoch and of all the right-wing capitalists are pushing anti-vaxxing, anti-masking, the whole Covid-as-hoax conspiracy theory, because like the anti-abortion movement, it divides the working class. It sets workers at each other's throats. It destroys the trust needed to build a movement that can threaten capitalist power and capitalist theft. This is precisely why today, a section of the capitalist class is supporting these fascist ideologies. They know that the developing global capitalist crisis, which we talked about in the last teaching, will require a downward spiral of working class standards of living and even existence. At the same time, capitalist wealth becomes more and more nakedly dependent on theft mediated by the state. To prevent the rise of a movement that demands that this theft stop, that threatens the very basis of capitalist power, the capitalists need diversions and division. Workers fighting each other. We see this in miniature in the many school boards that can't talk about improvements or even maintenance of education because of the anti-masking ranting. We see this on a large scale when people talk about what will happen if Roe v. Wade is overturned and states pass laws allowing any man to force any woman to bear his child, unless, of course, the woman has resources to flee to a free state. Allowed to grow, these fascist ideologies destroy the possibility of working class resistance to the capitalist destruction. They destroy our ability to preserve the very existence of the working class, to preserve the survival of civilization itself. So again, as with Les, the question is, how do we counter? First, we have to explain that capitalist individualism is a lie. Capitalist power has never rested on the power of individual capitalists. It's always been based on their collective control of the state, protecting capitalist power. Today, it is the capitalists, based on their collective control of the government, the Republicans and the Democrats, that are funneling $120 billion a year directly from the state to a handful of billionaires. That is through their collective control of the governments of China, of Europe, of Japan, of the United States. As the song goes, they have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. Their strength comes from that collective control, not from individual strength. So the idea of individualism is itself based on a lie. And we have to explain that to those who are sucked into this individualist ideology. Second, we have to isolate the hardcore of the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maxxers by exposing the real facts and the real intent of breaking up the workers' movements while the capitalists steal trillions. This is a huge diversion. We have to explain that. It's not true that anti-vaxxers can't be changed by facts. Here is an interesting statistic. I want people to guess how many Americans aged 65 to 74, my own personal age group, have had at least one shot against COVID. According to CDC, the answer is 100%. Obviously, they're rounding, but it means less than 0.5% of that entire age group has refused to get vaccinated, no matter what their ideologies are. They see before their eyes the lies that they have been told. They see their friends and relatives dying because they are unvaccinated. So facts can persuade. And finally, we explain to the many millions of people who would never want to be identified with the fascist movement that the idea of the strong individual has led and must lead to fascism, the opposite of freedom, as it did in the past century. We isolate the very small hardcore who would have no problem with identifying with the words of Adolf Hitler. So finally, we get to the question, what is real freedom? And we're going to go into this more in the next teaching. But the most important way, in my view, to explain what real strength and real freedom means is our ability to act in unison, to cooperate. All of humanity's achievements have been achieved through cooperation. Even our very human ability to speak to each other has been achieved through cooperation. Every word we say has been invented by some other human being. Real strength and real freedom comes from the realization, again, quoting the song, without our brains and muscles, not a single wheel will turn. It is our collective power that gives us freedom. And that idea that strength comes from our power to work has become more prominent with the pandemic that has dramatized the shortage of workers, the dependence of the entire world economy on the ability of people to produce goods and to move goods to their final destination. But real freedom can only come through the participation in a democratic mass movement where individuals can make contributions to the direction of the mass movement. In the 1930s, the German Communist Party, the KPD, the German Socialist Party, the SPD, could not fight the anti-democratic rhetoric of the fascists because they were anti-democratic in their own organization. Only through delegated deliberative bodies in a mass movement can we fight and defeat fascism, as again we'll go into in the next teaching. Rulers do not fear individuals. They fear people acting collectively. What do authoritarian regimes ban? They ban mass protests. They ban strikes. What is banned in the United States right now is effective strikes. Unification can only come when we make common demands on the corporations and the governments. We have to demand to expand the cooperative role of governance, because every society needs governance to run it, and minimize the coercive role of the state, the body of armed men that enforces capitalist rule. And what we mean by cooperation is cooperation for the benefit of the workers, not the billionaires. We mean diverting the $120 billion to fighting the pandemic, to building up public health, to building up housing, transportation, to building up aid to the rest of the world. We need to fight for higher wages, countering speed up, overcrowding, overwork, all of which contributes to the spread of the pandemic. Again, we'll discuss more on program in the next week's teaching. The threat to freedom comes not from the existence of the government. The threat comes from the fact that the capitalists run the government and the capitalists control the government. The Chinese government controls the financial, owns and controls the financial sector, but they run the financial sector for the benefit of the billionaires who control the Chinese Communist Party, which should be named the Chinese Capitalist Party, or CCP. It is only through mass movements that capitalist governments have been forced to give concessions to cooperative ventures like Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure projects, public education that benefit the working class. In the process of maximizing cooperation and minimizing coercion, we cannot overnight eliminate coercion from a capitalist society. We all presumably agree on the necessity for traffic laws, which have to be enforced by some means. The same with vaccination mandates, with masking mandates. They have to be enforced by some means. Under capitalist society, cooperation too has to be in some way coerced, but it is in our interest to minimize that coercion, just like we should demand that traffic cops not be armed to give you a traffic ticket. We should also demand the minimization of the coercion needed to enforce public health mandates. Obviously, the mandates today about employment are working pretty well. France has had great success with even less coercion, with vaccine passes that prohibit people who are unvaccinated from going to restaurants and other public places. So to conclude, basically, what is real freedom? Real freedom is socialism. Real freedom is the ability of the individual to participate democratically in the running of society, in the running of the economy at all levels. That is the concept of freedom that we have to counterpose to the individualist concept of freedom, which leads to fascism. So, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And now we're going to turn over to our last speaker, Marcy Smith-Parenti, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Marcy?
Hello.
Hi, Marcy. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Wow. Well, it's going to be interesting. Let's see if, how do I go full screen here?
You have to do slideshow.
Thank you. Got it. Okay. Well, again, thank you for inviting me. I think that in this moment, the formulation of these questions, what is fascism? What is freedom? It's the money shot. It is exactly the question that we need to be asking. And I think everybody can feel that the stakes are very high. So my understanding of why I was invited to join today, although after Eric's presentation, I wonder, in fact, why I was invited. But my understanding of why I was invited is to speak to my work on Gene Sharp. So I'm going to try to keep my sort of summary of that work short so that I can get into some of the new stuff and some of the contradictions and how this is sort of bearing out on politics today. So for those who aren't familiar with my work on Gene Sharp, which I assume is probably most of you, it's contained in a two-part essay published at nonsite.org, a few years, an open source peer-reviewed journal run by Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michael. Its title is Change Agent, Gene Sharp's Neoliberal Nonviolence. So who is Gene Sharp? Everyone agrees he's a prolific social scientist who lived, he passed in 2018, who focused his intellectual career on this question of the politics of nonviolent action. Politico described him as the most important political figure you've never heard of. So the question I deal with in my research is Gene Sharp, as he's popularly characterized in sort of hagiographic mainstream accounts of him, a peaceful tribune and prophetic intellectual of the people? My assessment is no. My assessment is that actually Gene Sharp is a really important Cold War defense intellectual whose kind of key career contribution was rationalizing the weapons of the weak, i.e. nonviolent struggle for US empire, for deployment against socialist countries and countries that were otherwise resisting the US agenda. You can read the sort of arguments and my evidence for why I argue for this pretty significant revision of how we think about how the left thinks about this, this intellectual Gene Sharp. But I guess one important thing to know is that whether or not you have heard of Gene Sharp, if you are on the left and if you've been engaged in any way with protest movements since the 1980s, your politics has been touched by his work. His ideas were popularized in the US, particularly by a new left formation called Movement for a New Society, which sort of innovated this, instead of doing political education, they did training. So probably many of us have attended activist trainings, and whether or not Sharp is named, his politics of nonviolent action, his list of nonviolent tactics is something that is part of the sort of canon of activist trainings. So indeed, his theories have endured most publicized US social movements since the 1980s. And then, Gene Sharp himself, along with his Albert Einstein Institution, was involved in the practical application of his own theories in contexts like the USSR, its collapse, Yugoslavia, efforts to, achieve regime change in Venezuela, and so forth. So that's sort of bringing us up to speed to some degree, I hope. So Sharp and Movement for a New Society both presented their ideas about nonviolent action as constituting actually a sort of ideological alternative to Marxism, which they termed revolutionary nonviolence. They, argued that revolutionary nonviolence was superior to Marxism because it offered a freedom and a peace that Marxism, so they argued, did not provide. And it suspiciously, but tellingly, revolutionary nonviolence, or at least the kind articulated by Sharp and MNS, was totally evacuated of a sort of class consciousness, historical materialism. So that gives us a clue as to what's going on. And according to revolutionary nonviolence, as articulated by these thinkers, the key mechanism for achieving freedom, peace, the both the means and outcome of a revolutionary nonviolent cosmology was to decentralize the state. So state centralization, quote unquote, was understood to be the sort of key mechanism by which violence happens in society. So raises a question, what exactly marks a state as centralized? According to Sharp, the key evidence that a state is too centralized is not that the state spends tons of money on prisons and police, secret intelligence agencies and so forth, but rather that the state is, in his view, inappropriately engaged in managing the market, interfering with the market mechanism. So to decentralize the state and so come closer to a perfect freedom and a perfect peace, we have to push back the state's presence and role in the market. We have to provide liberation for capital. So does this bear out? Is there a clear positive correlation between the size or centralization of a state, of the government, and the degree of freedom and peace for the masses in a society? It's worth thinking about. Can we think of a single instance in which freeing the market mechanism has translated into more freedom and more peace for the so-called 99%, for the working class? So this is just sort of an exercise that I did, trying to think about this. So, often in Marxist and socialist thinking, we hear reference to this idea that we're looking for freedom for workers and constraints for capital. And I think that's a good way to kind of, that's one important nuance in this question about what is freedom. Okay, and it's one that the ambiguity around this is something that neoliberals, apologists for capital have exploited to good effect since the Industrial Revolution. So we can certainly think of instances, historical instances in which both capital is repressed and constrained, managed, directed, and also the masses don't have much in the way of liberty either, and don't get me wrong, more often than not, I'm accused as being an apologist for Stalin and for the USSR, and perhaps fairly so, because I think that simply pathologizing the Soviet experiment is not very intellectually mature or very useful. But it's also, incorrect to say that the Soviet experiment offered a sort of flowering of, human liberty. Okay, that materially things really improved. Okay, so the USSR and China, I think, are good instances, good historical examples of instances in which capital and, labor both repressed. Instances in which capital is repressed. Well, actually, let me do the second one. Instances in which capital is liberated, but workers are still, have got the shank bit in their mouth pretty deep. Okay, lots of examples of this: the antebellum South, the Gilded Age, the present. Okay, and then the interesting question of, are there instances historically where we can argue that capital is repressed? Not the capital relation is not entirely extinguished, but it's repressed, it's managed. There's proportional taxation, there is regulation, so on and so forth. And we see also an expansion of liberty for the working class. And I would argue that the sort of the long New Deal era, which sort of begins with a material transformation in the balance of class forces, right, in the New Deal program itself, after which there is a superstructural transformation, the rights revolution, wherein we see the kind of most profound opening of civil liberties, you might argue, ever before seen in human history, which of course is terminated by the neoliberal turn. So we can think of all these, make arguments for all these examples, but I am hard pressed to think of any instance other than sort of imaginings of Hayek, Ayn Rand, Gene Sharp, among others, as to instances wherein both capital is free and workers have, amazing civil liberties, right? Protected. People can write and publish dissenting views and critique capital and so on and so forth. And why is this? I'm not going to belabor this point, but I suspect that it's because of the nature of capital itself, what it is. Capital isn't a person, it's not a human. There is the capitalist class, of course. There's a class that benefits and serves from capital, but it's a principle, MCM prime. So, take that for what you will. So, as I argue in part, actually, I discuss it in both parts of the essay, but the sort of effect of this pathologizing centralized government, okay, it does a few things. Number one, what I observed is it contributes to the left's inability to formulate ideologically coherent defenses to neoliberalism. Okay, so if the left is busy pathologizing the state, even if it is attempting to maintain a critique of capital, it's all the easier for capital to reduce the interference of the state in its affairs. Okay, number two, it helps rationalize left support for regime change operations, which we saw all throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And then it also, I observe, helps pathologize in general all forms of constraint, regulation, management, quote unquote, domination, implicitly all hierarchy as necessarily, essentially antisocial and violent. And part of the problem that I see with that is that there's a sort of denial of what psychoanalytics call the death drive, rather than an acknowledgement and embedding of this in generative, moral, and productive schemas. And the reason this is dangerous is because it paves the way for a return of the repressed. And I discussed this in detail with, in part two, analyzing George Lakey's kind of key text, wherein he spends sort of the whole book talking about how the left is so repressive and it's so bad and everybody needs to listen to him because he offers peace and freedom. But then at the very end, the vision is one of a centralized world government with no democratic checks, because he has a great, really sort of rich quote about how the revolutionary process is uneven. So we're going to have to suspend, all of these rights that I've been talking about for the previous 100 pages of this book. We're going to have to just, suspend them indefinitely until we get where I say we need to be. So what do we do? All right. If you buy my argument, if you think that there's merit in it, what do we do? So this is where part three is going to try to offer some thoughts. Has not been published yet, but it's hopefully will be published in the next few months. So I argue that the way to counteract the demobilizing, class consciousness scrambling effects of what I have, for lack of a better idea, termed Sharpianism, is to contest for revolutionary nonviolence, expressed as democratic socialism. And valuably, the definitive source of guidance for how we go about doing this is Martin Luther King Jr. So some context for why I'm arguing this. You got to understand that Gene Sharp, in his moment, post-war, Cold War, people are genuinely, including elites, are genuinely exhausted with violence. And it's clear the Department of Defense funded Sharp's research into nonviolent action. Setting aside elites, whether they are cynically pretending like they are tired of violence, I mean, the public is exhausted. Okay, we've just been through 2 world wars, and there is this question of, okay, well, how do we advance U.S. interests in a way that doesn't threaten public consent? Okay, because people are exhausted of bloodshed. And there's this question, who or what can deliver peace? And tellingly, in Sharp and M&S's literature, there is a clear and consistent effort to class Marxism, all strains, and socialism and class struggle as violent. That this is like an essential part of what Marxism and socialism is about. Like, they want to chop off people's heads. You know, they want conflict and war and bloodshed, and they're, you know, just maniacal, bloodthirsty tyrants. Okay. There are a lot of things that I could say to challenge this characterization. But I think one great data point is Karl Marx himself in 1872 saying this: "In our midst, there has been formed a group advocating the workers' abstention from political action. We have considered it our duty to declare how dangerous and fatal to our cause such principles appear to be. Incidentally, retreat from politics, the kind of you know, normal channels of political action available to the polity here in the United States, is something that Movement for a New Society advocated. Someday the worker must seize political power in order to build up the new organization of labor. He must overthrow the old politics, which sustain the old institutions, if he is not to lose heaven on earth, like the old Christians who neglected and despised politics. But we have not asserted that the ways to achieve that goal are everywhere the same." Here's the key part. "You know that the institutions, mores, and traditions of various countries must be taken into consideration, and we do not deny that there are countries, such as America, where the workers can attain their goal by peaceful means." So in the 20th century, the realization of this idea that Marx is describing, you know, as approaching the new century, this is a key threat. The idea that there would be a class-conscious movement after World War II that is manifesting the possibility of political economic revolution through nonviolent means. And this was a threat. And the name of the threat was Martin Luther King Jr. specifically. I love this picture because I think it's pictures worth 1,000 words. Martin Luther King does not look happy standing next to, it appears, being lectured by Nelson Rockefeller. I was a nonprofit executive director for a time, and I know this feeling. But of course, Daddy King, MLK's dad, is standing there looking at him like, "Sit up straight, young man, okay? Don't bite the hand that feeds you." But MLK would go on to bite the hand that feeds him, that fed him. This is a big and sort of complicated slide, and part 3 is going to go into this in more detail. But just to give you a sense, what I'm doing is comparing and contrasting how Sharp's version of revolutionary nonviolence and King's version of revolutionary nonviolence. King also uses this concept of revolutionary nonviolence, how they compare with each other, okay? How do their concepts of violence and peace compare? How do their concepts of class, how do their attitudes toward communism compare? Attitudes toward the state, conceptualization of revolution, the sort of moral character of their worldviews and kind of political economic visions. So I won't go through all the details, but you can take a look at this, food for thought. But as you look at this, I mean, consider how interesting it is that if you ask most activist leaders in the United States who the father of nonviolent action is, they will say Gene Sharp. He's regularly characterized in this fashion in activist literature, in the mainstream press, including the liberal left press. And whereas we have, you know, boulevards and schools named after Martin Luther King Jr., you know, his vision of a kind of class-conscious, internationalist, peaceful, revolutionary nonviolence is not taken seriously. He's invoked religiously, but you know, how many activists have participated in trainings wherein King's ideas are not merely invoked, but sort of addressed with any sort of seriousness and rigor? In my experience, and I spent over a decade in the climate movement and, you know, some time in the anti-mass incarceration movements, I never experienced it one time. So here's another way that they are different. They being King's vision of revolutionary nonviolence, his class conscious version, and Gene Sharp's neoliberal compatible version. And it gets at, I mean, everybody who has spoken thus far has spoken to this thing, and it's the thing that's in front of our faces, all of our faces right now, sort of exploding all over the place. This contradiction between sovereignty and cooperation. It's also known as, you know, you can formulate this and think about it as the tension between the individual and the collective, the self and the other. This is not just a political problem, it's an existential problem. I'm acutely aware of this, having just given birth. My son is of me, but different from me. There is, you know, we are fundamentally knitted together, but experiencing this in separate bodies. Okay, so this is a big thing, and how we sort through this directly informs how we conceptualize things, such as violence and freedom. So the left, in my view, has not digested this contradiction very well at all. I think King was attempting to, but King was, and his movement were violently crushed. So just examples of how this contradiction is not digested is the sort of simultaneous call for among, you know, by the same individuals and the same organs of the left, self-determination and open borders. Prison abolition camps for non-consenting COVID negative Aboriginal Australians. Okay, what principle is directing here? It seems to be that it's kind of like good people and bad people, but to me, that is inadequately robust. That doesn't make any sense to me. My baby is crying. I'm sorry. I'm going to continue, but just go let him see that I'm here. So Sharp's political economic vision, you know, as we've said, asserts the value of freedoms, right? And when I say individual freedoms, you can read what I mean by that, okay? And he argues that the way to preserve and expand those freedoms Sharp argues that the way to preserve and expand those freedoms is to decentralize the state. And as I've already tried to lay out, in my assessment, that both doesn't work and leads to this very troubling sort of domination anxiety problem. By contrast, King's political economic vision, and this is clear throughout all of his work, but it is especially clear in his work from his Riverside address in 1967 up until his death, that civil and political rights for the individual are essential prerequisites for an enduring regime of emancipated labor, enduring because it's based on the consent of labor. So to help us understand how this contradiction is, in my view, sort of blowing up in our face right now, I want to remind us about Marx's observation that part of what capital does is it takes everything that is solid and melts it into air. So MCM prime, the logic of capital, is a quest for endless accumulation. And this quest seeks to transcend, that is to say, destroy all limits upon it, moral limits, cultural limits, biophysical limits, technological limits, etc. It never succeeds. It always goes bust, but it does inflict a lot of collateral damage along the way. All while characterizing this quest as promising liberation for everyone. As Marxists, as socialists, we have a thoroughgoing critique of this. So I'm going through this to help us understand my view of sort of where we are situated in this moment. This quest produces crises, thank you, of overaccumulation. There's too much capital, too few places to profitably invest it. As all the surrealist filmmakers pointed out, it's like we are choking on our own hoarded excrement. Crises of accumulation set off a chain reaction. Markets get frothy, there are busts, capital then gets scared and retreats. That's right. Production slows down, there are layoffs, the consumer base, demand shrinks. This fuels even more productive slowdown and economic depression. Mere stimulus, we are seeing this right now, without attendant burn-off, i.e. redistribution, transformation of the balance of class forces, control over capital, only drives inflation, exacerbates misery, and drives toward a more cataclysmic kind of systemic shutdown. Meaning, where the restoration of energetic equilibrium is resisted for long enough, war becomes inevitable. This is, I think it could be argued, a thermodynamic reality of life on Earth, but the Industrial Revolution and the reign of the money form has put this cycle into overdrive. Credit to my husband, Christian, for hipping me to George Bataille's The Accursed Share. But in it, I think he argues very compellingly that, and this is a more kind of esoteric observation made across world religions, that humanity's chronic problem is not scarcity, it's energetic surplus and the political problems that it creates. So, how this bears on our moment. One key marker of crises of overaccumulation is a kind of popular rage for the reimposition of limits. Enough. No. Capital is seeking to transcend, accumulate. There is this kind of return of the repressive motion. Of course, capital doesn't like this. And this motion leaves open the question, limits for whom? For what? So I think historically, we can observe that in moments of crises of overaccumulation, popular clarity sort of organically emerges that there is a class comprised of individuals, which is directing, as I put it, this vortex of common misery, okay, even as their own power and benefits are protected and augmented. Be they called elites, the 1%, the ruling class, capitalist class, whatever. But capital has ways to interrupt this organic, intellectual dialectic, this coming to consciousness of the working class. And as several people have already mentioned, scapegoating. Historically, we see this, and in the present, we see this vis-a-vis a foreign power. We see this vis-a-vis a narrow kind of criminal element in the ruling class. We see this as well as an allegedly criminal or antisocial element in the masses. I think right now we're seeing all those strategies going at full throttle. And part of how this works is that it affirms the sensation that people have that we need to check the limit of the individual. We need solidarity, we need cooperation, i.e. the limitation and the subordination of the individual to the collective against this manufactured threat that is driving this vortex of misery. So what happens? Labor ends up cutting its own throat. We saw it in Nazi Germany, consents to be stripped of their individual will, their individual rights, their individual freedoms, undermining their own struggle for self-emancipation. The burn-off is achieved, all right? And it looks like crimes against humanity for the scapegoated population. And capital's power, meanwhile, is preserved and reinscribed. So yes, pandemic politics, it's all exploding in front of us. I hear what Eric Lerner is arguing, and I think that there is merit in a lot of what he's saying that has to be contemplated and sorted through. But here is what is also true, that since the beginning of this pandemic, we have seen an extraordinary upward redistribution of wealth. We have seen massive repression worldwide and a crumbling of civil liberties, including habeas corpus. If you have questions about this, Amnesty International, which is no, I mean, call it, you know, it's perhaps fascist in the neoliberal sense, you know, but is obviously not on Murdoch's payroll. Look at their 2020 report. I mean, I think anybody who is indulging in the illusion that censorship is not occurring right now, state-sanctioned censorship is not occurring right now, is in a kind of political danger zone, just because you're not grokking what's happening. And also extraordinary liberal left apologetics for some of the most vicious and deranged elements of the capitalist class. Look, I was raised on the right wing. Nobody needs to convince me of where that road, the cul-de-sac that terminates in. I am very, very well aware. But all this has been happening, and the virus is still here. COVID waves are sweeping the most densely vaccinated states and countries. So I hate to end on a sort of sad note, but I think we have to sort of understand where we're at in order to get our minds around it. But the left is, you know, has been the steward of the best parts of the Enlightenment, including the scientific method and the expansion of the individual's capacity, the worker's capacity to be more, pardon me, than a mere spigot of labor power, to reject the servility of feudalism and to reject the servility of capitalism, to claim self-respect, and from that self-respect, enter a new social contract wherein the fruits of our collective labor are shared. This left is collapsing in front of our eyes. And I hate to be that grim, but as King said, you know, those of us who have been called to speak, for us, it's frequently an agony, but we have to do it, you know, and I don't think that the culmination of King's movement and the tragic culmination of King's life is inevitable. And I think part of what interrupts that violent, cataclysmic cycle is us speaking, regardless of the risk of getting called names, regardless of the discomfort that it can create. So humbly, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Marcy. Can you close that out now? Or
How, I'm trying to figure out how.
Oh,
Sorry.
I think you go to your share screen and that, or
Pause share. Okay. Is it gone?
no, there should be a button that says end share, or what do they call that?
You have to go to the top of the screen, Marcy, and view options, and you should be able to close the screen, to end screen sharing at the top.
Okay. I see mute, stop video, security, participants, new share, resume share, stop share.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, well, thanks to Marcy, Eric, Les, and Jeremiah. Excellent presentations confronting, as all have recognized, the serious threat of the return of the fascists, thought to have been buried in the last war. It's rearing its ugly head from Kenosha to Kolkata and from Brasilia to Budapest. So we're going to now open it up. So the ground rules you can make a comment or a question directed to one of the panelists, but we want to keep it to 2 minutes so we can have the most number of participants in this conversation. So if you would like to, if you have a question, just raise your hand. We're going to take about 3 or 4, and then we'll turn it back to the presenters. So I know there must be folks out there. Give you a chance to digest. And as I mentioned, we've got Karen Ponce, our proud graduate of our department and now leading the struggle on the front lines of the class struggle to organize Amazon in Staten Island. In Staten Island. Okay. I actually have a question too, but I would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask. We have Mike Howells from New Orleans with us. Okay, we have Day. Okay, yeah, so we've got, great, we've got to make, okay. So we have Day and then Lenny, and there was someone else that said they had a question. I mean, the panelists could ask questions too.
Yes, Karen Ponce has a question
Okay,
for Les Leopold.
Yes, well, I'm gonna use my privilege of the chair to allow Karen to go first. I don't think anybody would have a problem there. So let's go with Karen, Day, and then Len.
Okay,
So go ahead, Karen.
Hello, everyone. Les Leopold, I actually read your book for one of my classes in CSI, and I think it was very helpful. It has a lot of charts. It explains the financial strip mining that goes on and basically how all of our problems link and the gap inequality from the CEOs and workers. Everything is nicely explained. So as Professor Arena said, now I'm one of the organizers for the Amazon Labor Union in the warehouse in Staten Island. I noticed that there's a problem of trying to get everyone on the same boat, right? Educating them and the people who do not agree that we need a union. You mentioned that we can use your book as a training and your website. I just wanted to ask, how do you think we can incorporate these ideas to support the organizing of a union at the warehouse, right? And then so we have our general demands, you know, we want higher pay, we want real breaks. You know, ideally we would like to tax Jeff Bezos. What would you recommend in terms of getting more organized? That is my question.
I can help you more on.
Les, can we just go?
It's messy, sorry, but yeah.
Okay, so Les, can we just, we'll take a few more questions and then we'll go back to you. Okay.
You're counting on me being able to remember that long. Okay.
All right. Okay, Day and then Len.
Well, really interesting presentations, all of them. Thank you. And it was interesting to hear the difference of opinion between Marcy and Eric Lerner about the vaccine issue, which I'm particularly interested in. I noticed that there's been a lot of vaccine injury, Bell's palsy, for one thing, Guillain-Barré syndrome and other vaccine injuries. So I wonder how the left could justify enforcing in any way the vaccines. Also, I thought it was interesting, Marcy wrote prison abolition and at the same time quarantine camps for non-consenting COVID negative Aboriginal Australians. I wish you could speak more about that, Marcy. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Day. Len? Lenny, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I want to ask, and its formation, a relatively simple question, but maybe very complex. By the way, Marcy, I heard at the Quad Cinema, some people came from the battles in Egypt, and you could hear, I could hear at any rate, Gene Sharp and the danger he was posing for what happened and eventually did happen. So I thank you for that presentation. But I wonder, I've been thinking about what the common thread here is, and in the definition of fascism and the notion of liberation, and also, the conversation that Jeremiah had about the Frankfurt School. So the question is, how much do you think a kind of pessimism has, in general, filled the left, but pessimism that's deep and has a very deep philosophical root that is causing the problem of lack of mobilization towards socialism, that in a way we've legitimized so much pessimism that it's very hard to mobilize people. So that's my question. How much do you agree with that or disagree with that? Thank you.
Okay, well, let's go back in the order of these questions were asked. So Karen had the first question, and let's go to Les for a response, and then we'll go to the others.
Yeah, we've been in dialogue with Amazonians United in New Jersey, and they're being coached by a guy named Gene Bruskin, Bruskin. If you, I'd suggest you reach out to Gene Bruskin, GeneBruskin @gmail.com. And there may be possibilities that some joint education could be done with them and your group, because I think they're facing exactly the same problems you're facing. I happen to believe that the educational kind of workshop environment is really the best place to do what you're saying you want to do and what needs to be done to build that kind of solidarity. And it gets even better when we can train Amazon workers themselves to run the workshops. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. But if you reach out to Gene, maybe there's a way to for us to start to work together over the next period of time, both groups. And if you want books, we can get you as many as you want. Just ask Jay.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind just typing the email again in the chat if that's okay? Or
Sure,
maybe...
I'd be glad to. Be glad to.
Thank you.
And you could tell Gene that I was passing this on to you.
Okay.
And there's one more person I'll find for you as well.
And then, so Day's question was kind of directed to Eric and Marcy, if you guys want to weigh in.
Marcy, you want to go first?
Sure. So to the simple question first. Yes. So not this Monday, but the past Monday, the Australian government confirmed that it was activating quarantine camps in Northern Territory for both COVID positive people and people who had been in quote unquote close contact, i.e. they're COVID negative, but they've been around somebody who tested positive. There's been mainstream coverage of several escapes that have happened and manhunts that have followed. And these are targeting in particular the Aboriginal communities in Northern Territory whose vaccination rates are in general under 40%. So just, you can Google that story and it's, it's been reported in mainstream outlets. This is not like from a Reddit thread. You brought up the issue of vaccine injury, and I think that, and then the next question was sort of about pessimism, and And I sort of feel like these two things are related. So it's very easy, for myself included, to feel extraordinarily depressed and pessimistic about the sort of state of things, from my point of view. But I actually think that there is something extremely profound in the argument that society is having right now about vaccines, because the vaccine principle strikes right at the heart of this individual, collective, sovereignty, cooperation dilemma, contradiction. And I really think for the prospering of the human species and for the full expression of, as Jeremiah put it, right, our species being, this is it. We got to figure this out. And we can't be didactic and simplify, and I mean, underestimate or just not allow the fullness of this problem to be recognized. And I think that if we can discuss without pejorative and with a commitment to the best parts of the Enlightenment, if we can talk about it, I think we're going to get there. And I don't think it's going to be so simple as no one ever takes a vaccine again, and we don't have, requirements for people to take vaccines. But I do think it might involve a recognition that, Pfizer is no Jonas Salk, and there's a conversation that needs to be had about the fact that vaccine manufacturers are 100% immune from liability for any vaccine injury. And the fact that, when you get a vaccine on the childhood schedule, you have just claimed the largest market, again, with no legal liability for any pharmaceutical product. So, I think that I'm sorry. I think that there's a way that the pharmaceutical industry is successfully right now using the word vaccine as a kind of magic wand that sort of suspends intellectual inquiry. Okay, and I think we have to dispense with that. There are many things that are good, but in excess or under certain circumstances become problematic. So whether it's vaccine injury, whether it's suspension of civil liberties in the case of the Aboriginal incident I just described, we got to deal with it. Okay.
Okay. Marcy, you're done, or was that just an interruption for baby?
I can be done. I've said enough. Thank you.
Okay. Very cute. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm a physical scientist. I'm a physicist. Numbers are what I do every day. And when we look at vaccines, masking, quarantine, countries that have done this in an effective way, and as I say, we certainly agree that we should minimize coercion, have a completely different result. I mean, in South Korea, which at the moment is a democratic country, the death rate is 70 per million. The United States is 2,500 per million. In Russia, where the vaccination rate is lower than in the United States, because of a higher degree of distrust in the government, the death rate is even higher. We're talking about the difference between, we're talking about tens of millions of people dying. And absolutely, this is not purely the result of people refusing the vaccine. If you're a resident of the continent of Africa, You don't have a choice of refusing the vaccine because in very few countries in Africa is there any vaccine available to you. And people in Africa, public health people, say frankly they have absolutely no idea what's happening with the virus in Africa because they don't have the resources to trace it. But what we do have, we have centuries of experience with vaccination, with quarantine. Quarantines don't have to be repressive. Countries where this has worked, you get quarantined in a hotel, and we have plenty of hotels in the United States that are half or 90% empty, and you get your needs cared for the period that you need to be quarantined, which is with this disease, something like 10 or 12 days. The key thing is, if you look at vaccine side effects, you have mortality rates that are down in the tens per million. And if you look at the mortality rate of the virus, you've got mortality rates that are in the tens of thousands per million, because depending on the country, the mortality rate of COVID is anywhere between 1% and 5%. So, there is no, in my view, there is no scientific question that vaccination, masking mandates, quarantines done in an organized fashion, and you have to have good organization, can save millions of lives. And in countries that are unquestionably democracies and are unquestionably respecting civil rights, such as New Zealand, there's practically no COVID at all. So what is at stake here? And Marcy, 100%, I think we're on the same side of the barricades. But what is at stake here is to separate people's concerns about their own health from this individualistic virus that has allowed the biological virus to spread. The idea that it's me first and the devil take the hindmost. Without that attitude, not only on the part of millions of people, but on the part of government institutions, this virus would have killed maybe 10,000, maybe 100,000, but not tens of millions of people. It could have been stopped in its tracks. I absolutely agree with you that the United States government's relationship with the pharmaceutical companies is criminal. The United States government has funded the research that developed the vaccines. Under United States law, the United States government, when it funds research, has a royalty-free license to use that intellectual property. The United States government could have said, this is our money, this is public money, you don't get a penny of profit. This is going to be distributed universally and with wartime production. And if the Defense Department's industrial resources had been mobilized, would be mobilized even today, we could get to universal vaccination very quickly, and we could snuff out this disease before it mutates further. But the key question is separating this, the questions people have, which have to be answered scientifically, about what are the dangers of the vaccine, from this whole ideology of me first and the devil take the rest of society. Vaccinations, quarantines, masking is the best way to protect individual health. The best way to protect, my health is being protected. I'm in a vulnerable age group because in the part of the world where I live, in New Jersey, for some reason, people are all masking up. The vaccination level is rising rapidly. In my age group, as I say, it's almost total for at least one shot. The idea is the individual's health is protected by collective action in favor of the working class. And absolutely cut out what's happening to the capitalist class. Seize the money that the Fed has delivered to the capitalists, which is perfectly legal. The Fed could sell its 3 trillion holding overnight, and overnight we would have socialized ownership of all of the 700 largest corporations in the United States. So collective action is needed to fight this virus, and at the same time to fight capitalism.
I'm wondering, is it possible for me to just say a few kind of clarifying things in response? Because I do think that this is a rich question. I can wait as well, but.
Yeah, well, yeah, Marcy, you could go, and then we'll go to Jeremiah. Fine, because, yeah, go ahead.
Is that okay with you, Jeremiah? Okay, thank you. So, Eric, just from where I am sitting, my point of view, I don't think that you and I are on the same side of the barricade. But that is okay. That doesn't upset me. I think we can get to the same side of the barricade, but I don't think that is where we are at right now. And here is why. About when was it? August. I published a pretty long investigative piece on reports which have since been confirmed by the National Institute of Health of menstrual dysregulation post-vaccination. And so I'm moved. I have hesitations about this, but I am moved to sort of be clear about where I am coming from. As a breastfeeding mother, I am not going to take a pharmaceutical product that was approved via an accelerated process for which the pharmaceutical industries have no liability, for which there are reports that hormonal issues can follow that particularly impact hormonal cycles for women, where the drug in question doesn't prevent transmission, and the FDA, CDC, pharmaceutical industry has never claimed that it prevents transmission. I'm not going to take that product. I'm a no. And I'm a no all the way to the scaffold. So I don't think it's going to get there, but I will submit my heart for searching before history, and history's God. This is not a selfish thing, okay? This is about respect and precedent. Now, what I'm saying is not in necessary tension with the point you are raising, that this virus attacks certain groups, certain vulnerable groups in particular. And so our response has got to recognize that. Now, I don't think our society, even as it name checks the vulnerable, has done a very good job at that. And I think that that problem begins way before we get to the question of vaccination. Cuomo, right, and nursing homes, right? I mean, I have lots of friends who have, gotten COVID and gone to doctors to try to get treatment, right? And there is a big conversation that history will have about the utter failure, which is, I think, probably criminal, around lack of early treatment protocols and active suppression and censorship of simple stuff that can treat early COVID. So, you raise masking, I agree with you. There is evidence that masking really helps. There's also evidence that masking has really deleterious effects on children. Okay, so that's a big public policy conversation and debate that needs to be had without people who are raising the point, this is having negative developmental effects on kids. It's having negative physical health effects on kids, being called anti-vaxxers, fascists, so on and so forth. Because even though we are not getting an accurate picture in media, those of us who are saying these things are not all fascists and anti-vaxxers. Again, full transparency, my son has all of his vaccines. Okay. Anyway, so I remain hopeful that we're going to keep pushing this dialectic, but it does require that those who have questions, those who have dissenting points of view, raise our voices, right? And I don't think that it's gonna land us on the scaffold. I really don't.
So Eric, did you want a brief response or we'll go to Jeremiah?
Well, I think we got to give people turns. So we'll obviously continue this dialogue, but I don't want it to be totally a back and forth between me and
Jeremiah?
Marcy.
Okay, so again, apologies for my voice. I'm assuming I'm responding to the question about pessimism. So I have a lot to say, scribbled down a bunch of notes. I'll try to be able to do it in a coherent way. I think that pessimism is a problem. I don't think it's the most significant problem. I believe it's part of kind of a constellation of things that are kind of holding the left back right now. Something that as I mentioned, the Frankfurt School tend to engage with some real problems that happened in the 20th century. And I mean, that's one of the major problems for the left, is the fact that the 20th century did happen. I mean, and in particular, just saying, the legacy of the USSR, communist China, Mao, the amount of sort of the human toll that took place as a result of these things is something which we tend to be in a place of either trying to ignore it and not really engage with the problems associated with it, or trying to just say, oh, well, all socialism is necessarily authoritarian, so let's just kind of get away from that dangerous word. That tends to, but there has to be a way to really face that and try to move beyond it. And the writings of the Frankfurt School, and that they've been considered to be pessimistic, but I see it as a challenge to be able to face those kind of things and actually conscientiously move beyond them and bring movement forward to a new place. So this is the first thing. The second thing is essentially that, since the mid-20th century, society has become, or the United States has become, a much more diverse society. So in this situation, the left has taken on trying to support diversity and diverse groups, and the right has taken on essentially trying to suppress and extinguish diverse groups. Extinguish is a strong word, but I mean increase homogeneity. So the left, the problem with the left's position, and I support the left's position, however, the thing that's hard about it is the fact that there's contradictions regarding sovereignty of the individual and the whole society that are there in having a diverse society that we haven't really figured out how to talk about and work through and have something coherent to say about. I want to say there's the problem of the sovereignty of the individual culture against the connectedness of the whole society. We tend to be too hostile to one another's opposing views to be able to have civil conversations about it. People are afraid of being accused of various things, so they don't. It's easier not to have conversations, or the conversations are just, they seem to me to be a lot of mudslinging. It's not that bad. People are starting to recognize this, but I think that's their issue. In terms of overcoming some of the issues of the 20th century, this kind of I think there's two arguments against socialism that are essentially cliched tropes, and those are important to argue against or to find a good rebuttal to, which is, one is just this old, it's human nature to be lazy. If you have socialism, nobody will want to work. That's one. That there are easy things to say about that, but that one needs to be addressed. The other is the issue about calculation, for economic calculation in a planned economy, and is that feasible, and does it necessarily lead to authoritarianism? That issue, the calculation versus an authoritarian issue, needs to be addressed. I think a lot of attention could be put there, which would be really useful. The trouble is you get a lot of complicated arguments that don't really inspire anybody. People are inspired by visions that are coherent. And in that way, I agree with what Eric described, in terms of positing the individual's contribution, inclusion, democratic inclusion at all levels of society as a different vision from the strong individual narrative. I think that is really, that's something that people could connect to, and in a deep way that would really work. I suppose another one last thing, because I know that I'm kind of going on. Another thing that has happened somewhat, which is a kind of pessimism, I think, but it isn't really typically framed that way among the left, is the dropping of the notion of self-actualization from the vision of the better society. So basically, we're unifying more around narratives of us being liberated from them, and not so much around envisioning a new way of life for everyone. And the us from them issue is at times extremely important. But if we don't have a vision of the new way of life, first of all, we won't inspire anyone. And second, we don't know what we're going to do, even if we become liberated. All right, that's my response.
Okay, thank you, Jeremiah. So we're going to throw it back to the audience we'll take 2 or 3 more questions. Christina, I thought you just had your hand up. Did you have a question?
No, it was just clapping.
Oh, okay. Oh, that was a clap, not a hand raise. Okay, great. That's fine. Anybody else? I have a question and a comment, but I want to see if others. No. Tony?
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't. I don't have a question.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, well, while others are thinking about their question, I have I guess it's a response to Marcy's question, and then I have my own question. So just, Eric and I were one of there's been a whole committee that's put this series together, but we reached out to you because of our own earlier experience in the demands working group of Occupy Wall Street. And we, as part of that working group, we put forward
demands working group. You poor people.
Yeah, it was a torturous experience.
There was some fun in it, though.
Yeah, no, it was good. But we put through, for a public works program, a direct government employment, public services and public works paid for by taxing the rich and ending the war machine that Gene Sharp was financed by. And we experienced, deep hostility to making any kind of demands on the state. And so when we saw your work, it really spoke to kind of the deeper roots of that, as well as Les's great work and his kind of critique on silo organizing, which we also we saw expressed in the Occupy Wall Street. And then in my own research around the privatization of public schools in Newark, and the kind of the arguments that were used by the Bookerites and the charter schools, I also saw resonated a lot with your critiques of Sharpism. And in fact, I want to, it is a forthcoming book. I want to give it a plug. We have to do this. We have to be our own promoters. But I just want to share this quote from your part one of your non-site piece that I've used, which I think is really powerful. You say, in Sharp's politics of nonviolent action, the state was not the prize, not even a train of struggle. It was the enemy, the object to be paralyzed and dissolved. And in this regard, Sharp fit neatly into the emerging neoliberal consensus, pathological hatred of the state, and an unerring faith in the free market. And so particularly, with this session, we thought your work and your critique of Sharpism spoke to, a lot of the, what has been driving the, I'm not putting you in this camp, but the anti-vaxxer movement, the deep opposition to any kind of state intervention to confront the pandemic. And so that's for me, and now I see you have a different perspective. So for me, I see kind of a contradiction from this kind of critique of Sharpism, and then your kind of position around the pandemic. The political response, the state response on the pandemic. So that's my, clarification of, why you invited. We're very happy that you did accept, but that's my kind of question.
Thank you. That's great. That's what I thought. And I, I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to talk yet.
No, well, I don't, if we don't, is there any other, let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, Len has a second one. Len, you have a second one? Which is fine.
Oh, okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think part of the problem is that's going on between Marcy and Eric, and what you're bringing up is that we have eliminated any kind of notion of gray areas to deal with vaccination. And I think we should address gray areas. I think it would be healthy for the whole contradiction in the country, and it would be healthy to deal with some of these issues, and it would be an advance towards a more socialist and more, progressive government. I think there's a hype of fear of dealing with gray areas, and I think that's terrible. And can just become explosive with the movements that we've seen to stop the funding of the federal government. That these things, as you try to choke off public discussion, you're going to get an explosion. And you're feeding right into the pessimism and fear. And I think if there's reasonable people, it would actually help everything to have a discussion of some of the nuances. Anyway, that's it.
We've had two. Is there anyone else before we go back to the panelists? Avram, I thought you might have had a question. Or Matt from West Virginia, we're glad you joined us.
I've got something I'd like to say about the pandemic issue and science and the sort of sides taking, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I do think that it's a bit unfortunate, and again, one of the problems that the left is stuck in, that we have this alignment around science, which seems to be this political alignment around science right now, where the left has to be pro-science because the right is anti-science. That's kind of what's going on. And because the left can't be the right, then the left must support anything that is pro-science, which essentially means that the left is aligned with any sort of control measures that are instituted, and that we can't dissent from that, because if we do, then we're kind of positioning ourselves as in alignment with the right wing. That's a problem. So yeah, gray areas need to be discussed, but it's that's a lot of it. People do not want to be associated with the other side, and so just move in these directions. But science is a contested area, or is better seen as an area for debate than as just a pure good.
Okay. So do we respond now, Jay?
Well, I thought Marcy wanted to respond. I had a question for her, but did you?
Okay, go ahead, Marcy.
I went like first last time, so if somebody else wants to
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Well, look, I mean, again, full disclosure, I'm a scientist. I've been one for a long time. Science is a way of determining what reality is, what truth is. And philosophers spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. Marx and Engels put forward the idea that the ultimate measure of truth is a survival of humanity. People know that what they're doing has a relationship to reality, because if it doesn't, in the end, they won't exist to wonder whether they're right or wrong. That's sort of a paraphrase from Theses on Feuerbach. So when I talk to people, including some scientists, who say, well, science is just one relative way of looking at things. I was talking to a scientist who was saying this in an airport, and I said, well, I suggest you don't get on that airplane. Because the only reason why we have confidence that airplane is going to stay up is that we have confidence that the science of aerodynamics contains a large element of truth about the reality of that part of nature. You know, I would say directly to Marcy, of course, there's no doubt that the vulnerability of people to this disease varies quite a bit. The vulnerable people are people who are overweight, people who have diabetes, people who have heart disease, people who have lung disease, and the risk increases with age. Now, the risk increases with age overall in almost exactly the same way as the overall mortality increases. So even though the mortality rate for people of your age, and I'm guessing you're in the vicinity of 30, is very low, COVID has increased that mortality rate for young people by about 25%, something that's never happened in the past century. If you take the vulnerable people together in the United States, those groups that are vulnerable, you get something like 55 or 60% of the entire population. So when we're protecting the vulnerable, we have to be protecting most of the population. If you look at the science, if you look at dozens of scientific studies from people who have no relationship to Pfizer or Moderna, the effectiveness of the vaccines in preventing serious illness and death is very strong, especially soon after. It's obvious that they fade over a period of 6 months. And that's why countries that have vaccinated heavily can, and people obey masking as well, they get much lower mortality rates. So even at your age, the risks of having an adverse reaction to the vaccine versus the admittedly low risk that you would get serious illness from COVID still would lean in favor. Your risks would be reduced to your health by getting the vaccine. But this is a long discussion. This is things that have to be documented. But what the problem that I think comes from some of your argument is that the distrust of the pharmaceutical industry, which of course has been well earned, goes to a distrust of medical science, which is not earned. Because medical science has made huge advances, and there are many millions of people, medical researchers, who are producing research on COVID, who are doing honest studies that can be trusted. I do want to go back to my remark about the same side of the barricades. I'm talking about on the class war. I mean, my partner Ivy pointed out your article to me. And when I read it, I mean, I'm not sure this was literally true, but metaphorically, for most of it, my jaw was open because I thought to myself, what in the world was I doing 50 years an activist, and I've never even heard this guy's name. I honestly, until I read I had never heard the name Gene Sharp. And yet, I think you demonstrated abundantly that he and his co-thinkers had an enormous influence on the left over a period of decades. So I still will repeat that on the basic question of the class war, which is becoming, unfortunately, a war for survival, I would say we are on the same side of the barricade.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that this conversation is extremely fruitful, and I feel very happy that we've been able to have it. So some thoughts in response to the questions raised, and then things that you just shared, Eric. I think that we are in this crucible of existential questions. What is the future of the species? Is socialism and a sort of generative economy of cooperation and peace and exploration, or are we going to kind of yet again, perhaps with more finality than ever before, end up in the cul-de-sac of barbarism and civilizational extinction? So survival of humanity, I mean, I don't think that it's I was a climate activist for over 10 years. And so don't think that that's an overstatement to frame the thing that we confront in that way. To sort of probe the gray area that we're confronted with, I personally, now this is anecdotal, okay, I know that that is not scientific, but this is an anecdote that I does think offers something useful. So I know one person who has tragically died from COVID. I know one person who tragically has died very young from substance abuse patterns that got exacerbated during lockdown and isolation. And I know one person who, according to the doctors themselves, reporting it to VAERS and everything, died as a consequence of the second Moderna dose. So, I think we have to broaden our view of all the various ways that human survival is under attack right now. Yet another way that we haven't touched on and we don't have time to probe deeply now, but that I think all of us should be thinking about, are the implications of a biomedical digital passport system. Capital will build upon and expand this system of eugenic surveillance well after COVID is gone. If we consent to this now, it is not going to go away. And in the manner that things like this often happen, it is being smuggled in under the pretext of the virtue of being a good citizen. So I think we need to think long and hard. Those of us in the major cities, are we comfortable consenting to this future, for generations to come? Because once it's here, it is going to be very, very, very difficult to get rid of. So Jeremiah, I think your comments about science are on the money. I've been thinking about this a lot because as a climate activist, what do we say? Follow the science, right? I have been feeling a bit sheepish for having chanted that for so long because anytime that in particular science, I think, is offered with the implication that it is not ideologically charged in the same way that freedom, you always have to inquire more deeply. Well, what is it that you actually mean by freedom? Freedom for capital, freedom for labor? What are you talking about? Science, medicine in particular. I mean, Eric, I hear you. Medicine gave us penicillin. Yes, but it also gave us twilight birthing. Medicine gave us Jonas Salk, but medicine also gave us the opioid crisis. So, there's a great little pamphlet that I haven't seen in a long time, Barbara Ehrenreich, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, which is about the feminist dimension of this, the feminist struggle vis-a-vis medicine, right? And the role of the white coats, the role of doctors. Look, I'm a doctor, I'm a juris doctor, okay? The role of people like us in the sort of seizure of knowledge about the human body, which is actually key to the sovereignty of the working class and to the peasantry. The seizure of this from medicine women, from the shamans. Okay, I mean, this is getting into the gray area. And I think the gray area is where we need to be. And I think we need to trust the dialectic. And if we can be respectful, and to be clear, when I invoked the scaffold, I was not suggesting that I'm putting anyone on the scaffold. I'm just saying that it is incredible to me that this is how I feel, because what a hill to suggest I die on. I have barely thought about vaccines and pandemics, until all this began. But this is how strongly I feel about it. That's what I was trying to get at, right? And I think that if we can hold the gray area, recognize that we're distinct, we're having a conversation, trying to have a meeting of the minds and deal with this individual collective contradiction, I think we're going to get there. I think it is within the left that this really needs to happen, because indeed the danger is that we are AWOL, that we allow ourselves to be hypnotized via psychological warfare tactics that have been honed for almost 100 years, right? And so we abandon the working class to the right wing, right? Because the reality is the 99% includes a lot of Trump voters, right? We are contesting for them. And if we fall prey to the Democratic Party's strategy of simply demonizing them, we are not going to win. We're never going to win. So we have to press forward, not get trapped in this sort of quagmire that is being laid for us. I suspect quite deliberately. Given what we know about the nature of psychological warfare research and operations from the Cold War forward. And, one final thing to just, as Eric mentioned, I mean, yes, the vaccines do show strong efficacy against severe disease and hospitalization in the short term. But we are also observing, and this was clear from the outset, I read the emergency use authorization applications for all 3 vaccines. I've been following the science, which I am capable of reading, even though I don't have a degree in it, very closely. This idea that we're going to deploy universally, regardless of individual degree of risk from disease, a leaky and short-term vaccine, and then prescribe an indefinite course of boosters actually leads to the risk, I'm sure you know, of antibody-dependent enhancement, wherein people who have taken the vaccine are now at risk of getting more serious disease. So part of what I've actually been doing in my community is trying, now that we're in new waves in Massachusetts and Vermont, to nurse vaccinated people who are getting very ill and not getting adequate treatment from mainstream medicine. This is a very surreal experience that I'm observing and living through. Yeah, I think that the note I want to end on, though, is that just to affirm the woman who shared earlier about how, you know, we're hearing reports of vaccine injury. Okay, and indeed, there have been more reports of vaccine injury reported to VAERS than all reports since the creation of VAERS in 1987, so previous to this year, combined. So, I mean, this is using gene therapy technologies, all right? I don't think that it is at all clear what the balance in terms of this goal of human survival is yet. Okay, and for this reason, I think the question is how far everybody's making their own decision. People are going to feel very strongly that they want the vaccine, they want the boosters, they want everybody around them to get them. And there are going to be people on the other side who are like, I don't want this, okay? So the question is, how far are we willing to go to coerce, mandate people to take this medicine? All right, and I mean, I think that's something we all have to sit with. You know, how long will the emergency go? How long will the sort of suspension of norms go? What kinds of fascistic biomedical surveillance are we permitting, accidentally perhaps, in our quest to eradicate this disease?
Thank you, Marcy. So we're approaching the 5 o'clock hour. So we'll give Jeremiah, and then if any of the other two panelists have a closing comment, short comment, we'll give you that opportunity, and then we'll close it out. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll just bring this back to kind of a more general level, but still touching upon this sort of issue about science and right and the left and the pandemic, especially the left's attitude towards science, and also the relationship, what relationship did Marx have with science, or what is science in Marxism? And so that's a whole huge, I don't know, swimming pool of worms to get into, which I think I'd enjoy all those worms. But basically, I do want to mention that I'm of the opinion that it's important to not have a binary approach to it. Science is extremely important and beneficial to society. Facts matter. And also, there are some things that science cannot reach that are still important and need to be talked about. And Marx's, I'd even argue in Capital, his notion about labor and capital, his central concepts are not, they're not empiricists. So, I mean, he believed in a science, but his science also was taken from Hegel, although he rejected Hegel, but he maintained Hegel. And Hegel's science is not about empirical science; it's about the dialectical science. So, and I do believe in seeing things dialectically. I think the troubles, some of the troubles with the downsides of science are the sorts of things that it does to culture. In the process, the Frankfurt School talked a lot about sort of liquidating values and such and so forth. But it also does very beneficial things to culture, such as, you know, it tends to run along with the promotion of reason, rational deliberation. This are things that Habermas talks about. The fact that science and technology played a major part in the eugenics movement of the Nazis is a huge problem. The fact that science and technology are the things that could also lead us to have a society where we're liberated from the need to work as much as, well, we already are, but to a post-scarcity society. Yeah, that's essentially what I want to say.
Okay, any last comments from Les or Eric, and we're going to close it out? No, Les, Eric?
Yeah, I just want to say that there's a big difference between science and scientists. Again, speaking as a scientist, a lot of things that you'll find scientists say have nothing to do with science, even though they pretend it does. The science had nothing to do with the eugenics movement. There were a lot of scientists who supported eugenics, but eugenics was based on pseudoscience. It was based on something that had nothing to do with the scientific method, as was generally accepted at the time. The scientific method has been around for a while. So absolutely you have pseudoscience. And as a matter of fact, those quotes from Hitler show very clearly that he was trying to envelop his fascist philosophy in the mantle of science. This is how nature goes. There is a straight line leading from some, not all, of the proponents of Darwin, and in particular the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, directly to the development of so-called scientific racism in the late 19th century, which had a great influence on the development of fascism in the 20th century. So you'll have to distinguish science and the scientific method, which works, from what scientists say, which in some case may have absolutely nothing to do with science. But again, as I said before to Marcy, there's a big difference between taking a reasonable degree of skepticism to what scientists say and say, does this qualify by the scientific method, and simply dismissing what medical science has to say. So I absolutely disagree that science had anything to do with eugenics. And I absolutely disagree that medical science can be blamed for the opioid epidemic. The pharmaceutical companies and those who own them can definitely be blamed. And it's a damn shame that they aren't all in jail. So we're going to be discussing this.
Lock them up. On that note, lock them up.
About science and the role of science in socialism.
Okay. All right. Thanks for all our speakers. And Les actually has a great piece on one of his presentations on how the steel companies use the eugenics to divide up the workers in the plants based on that pseudoscience. But we want to thank everyone, our panelists and our audience. This has been taped, and we will make it available shortly and distribute it to folks. And next week, we hope you'll all come back. We're going to be having an important discussion on what is socialism, how do we advance the class struggle, and that'll be next Saturday at the same time, 2 to 5 p.m. So thanks a lot. Let's give a round of applause to our virtual and actual round of applause, and thanks again.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.